The decision to sell a business, our business, a business that we poured much of our life into, is a momentous decision. Today, I'm with Jeremy Cole, a seasoned corporate finance professional who's in the business of helping people realise their business selling ambitions. And today, Jeremy's going to share with us some of the essentials when it comes to selling a business. So Jeremy, I'm intrigued, just when you get that first phone call, what are the first questions that somebody asks you when they're considering selling their business?
The first and most obvious question is generally, how much is my business worth? So valuation, that's normally top of any business owner's list. I think Rudyard Kipling's 6 honest serving men spring to mind as well in terms of the other questions. So how much is the business worth? Why am I thinking of selling is another key one. When is the best time to sell? Is it now or is it a later date? Who will want to buy the business? The different types of buyers. And what does the sale process look like in terms of timescale and advisors, etc. And also, finally, where do I stand after completion of the sale? So those are the main questions, but valuation is always top of the list.
So when someone first asks you, and obviously you're not aware of the ins and outs of the business, how do you answer that valuation question, and how do you manage somebody's expectations?
We want a sense of realism before we're appointed. So we're always happy to spend time with potential clients, gather information, hear what they have to say, research their sector, see if we've done transactions that are relevant, to give effectively a complimentary view on valuation and timescales, potential buyers, because we want to go into the process with the client understanding how the process works and realistically how much their business is worth. Conversely, if you go into the process without that level of understanding, then there'll be problems further down the line in terms of unrealistic expectation. Valuation is an art, not a science. The ultimate truth is each business is worth what somebody's prepared to pay for it. So you can talk to 25 accountants about the value of your business and get 25 different figures, all perfectly justified. You can talk to 25 potential buyers of your business and you'll get 25 different views. So it's very much a case of beauty being in the eye of the beholder. And with trade buyers, that's mainly because what a buyer can do with your business is different to what somebody else can do with your business. So valuation is a very bespoke process.
Okay, and you mentioned the process. So what are the key stages in that process?
From a standing start, so if there hasn't been an approach from a buyer, the process tends to have 3 phases, and the graphic on the screen now shows how we manage a process. There's a preparation phase where we're gathering information, preparing the information memorandum, which is the main document for briefing potential buyers. We're researching potential buyers, agreeing a list with the owner of the business. And we're preparing other materials, getting ready to approach buyers. Then the second phase, which is the most important, we call going to market, which is where we engage with buyers. They sign non-disclosure agreements, they receive the information memorandum, we have meetings, we answer questions. And at the end of that second phase is when we look for indicative offers, and there's a series of negotiations, typically with the front runners, if you like. And at the end of that second stage, the buyer will sign heads of terms with the business owner, and we go forward with one single buyer into the third phase, which is due diligence and legal contracts. It's worth emphasising that our role in this final phase, liaising with the lawyers on the share purchase agreement, is critical in maximising the sale proceeds for our client in areas such as the calculation of net surplus cash that's added to the proceeds, the normalised working capital adjustment, and any earn-out terms and protections. If your corporate finance advisor is not all over these issues, the selling shareholders can end up leaving a lot of value on the table. One of the reasons why the second phase is the most important is when you go into a period of exclusivity in the third phase with a single buyer, the balance of negotiating power shifts from the sellers to the buyer because you're only dealing with one buyer. During the second phase, you're able to play off a number of buyers against each other. So it's important for the selling shareholders that they go into that third phase confident that they've picked the right buyer, that the terms are acceptable, and that nothing should really go wrong during due diligence and the legal contracts phase.
So they're the main stages, they're the three stages of the process, but from beginning to end, how long does it take?
You're looking at a process of between 5 and 12 months. The first phase should be no more than a month. Second phase, key phase, as we discussed, that's at least 2 months, and you shouldn't rush that phase. So that could be 4 months in itself. And then the final phase, due diligence and contracts, should be 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. So in total, if everything goes smoothly and the ideal buyer becomes apparent early in the process, you're talking about a 5-month process. If there's a lot of interest and good negotiations with buyers, and the buyer is a large group that does a lot of due diligence, then you're looking at a 9 to 12 month process.
Okay. And those buyers that you mentioned, so at a high level, what are the different types of buyers that we should be considering?
Generally 3 types of buyers: trade buyers, possible management buyout team, and financial buyers. Trade buyers are normally likely to offer the highest price because they potentially benefit from synergies, such as being able to cross-sell their services to our client's business and vice versa. They might be able to take a bit of cost out of the business or achieve better buying terms with materials. So all other things being equal, a trade buyer who benefits from those synergies won't hand over the entire benefit of those synergies through a massively increased price, but there's some negotiating leverage there for them to be able to pay what's euphemistically called a strategic price. The second type of buyer I mentioned, a management buyout team. We could talk for a couple of hours about management buyouts. They're a very unique type of business sale, and we advise on a lot of management buyouts on the buy side. From a seller's point of view, there are pros and cons to a management buyout, but fundamentally they're a very discreet form of selling your business, and subject to the funding being in place, they are a good form of sale. The third category of buyer is a financial buyer, so a private equity fund who is looking to buy the business, grow the business, and then sell it on typically in 4 or 5 years' time. So they don't have the benefit of those synergies with the trade buyers, but they do have access to funding, obviously, and they have a very simple agenda, which is purely one of investment return. They want to buy at a certain price and sell at a higher price in 4 or 5 years' time.
Okay, so you've hinted there at the benefits of those 3 types of buyer, but you were summarising the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, the pros of the trade buyer is mainly around price, and if they're in funds, they have a war chest of acquisition funding, then they can move more quickly, and the funding isn't a risk. The potential risks with trade buyers, often they're competitors of the client's business. So there are issues around commercial sensitivity for the ones who, despite them signing confidentiality agreements, they become aware of information about your business, and without them being disingenuous with that information, they will benefit from knowing that information if they don't go on and buy your business. But otherwise, trade buyers are normally the most likely type of buyers. With a management buyout, the advantage is it keeps the business independent, which might be important for the existing owners. And it's, as I say, a relatively controllable and discreet form of sale. The outside world doesn't need to get to know about it in terms of competitors, other businesses in your sector. The downside or the risks with an MBO are partly around valuation. An MBO backed by private equity won't pay as high a price as a trade buyer typically, and also the availability of funding. So raising funding for a management buyout is almost all externally sourced from private equity and debt. and therefore, whilst the MBO team may sign advisors and make an attractive offer in terms of price, the credibility of the funding is also fundamental to that being a realistic option. And with financial buyers, again, there's no synergies there. The business is carrying on as an independent business, so price is probably not going to be in the same space as trade buyers, but they do have the money, and this is what they do for a living, buying and selling businesses. So the transaction process is typically efficient and well informed.
Okay, great. So at the beginning you mentioned about timing. So just tell me a bit more about that in terms of the best time to sell within, say, the life cycle of the business, or the stage of life that the owner might be at, or what the external market and the economy is doing. So when's the best time to sell?
There's no perfect time. The last 5 or 6 years have shown us that however good you are at running your own business, there are external shocks to the system, geopolitical, economic, that the business owner can't do anything about and could impact on the timing of a sale. But they're outside your control, so let's park those.
Yeah.
In terms of factors within the business or affecting the business that the business owner can do something about, and the impact on the timing of sale, I think a key message to get across is to use the analogy of a wave building. You don't want to sell at the crest of a wave where you're leaving the buyer with limited further growth prospects. You want to sell the business when there's relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of further growth potential, further profit growth. So you want to sell when the wave is building rather than at the crest of the wave. You also want to sell when your management team is capable of taking the business forward without huge involvement by the buyer. So, for example, if your management team were all in their mid-60s and wanting to retire shortly, and you don't really have a strong second-tier management, that's not a good time to sell. If you have a management team that is a mix of ages and you've got a succession plan in place for the older ones, then that's a good time to sell. The other area where a buyer will typically focus is customer relationships. So, for example, if you have 80% of your turnover dependent on one customer and the framework agreement with them expires in 6 months, clearly not a good time to sell. If in the preparation phase you've had a business development push and you've diluted that dependency, or you've signed a new framework agreement extending 3 years, again, that's going to add to valuation, add to buyer interest.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like the earlier the better. So even if somebody's thinking, it might be 10 years away, speaking to someone like yourself and then periodically every year or two touching base again would be a good
absolutely. Preparation is absolutely fundamental to a successful sale mandate. If a business owner receives an unsolicited approach and that prompts a sale process without talking to other buyers, there's clearly less time to prepare properly for the process. But if it's what's called a controlled auction process, which is the normal process that I talked about with our Gantt chart, the 3 phases, then the preparation phase is absolutely vital. Ideally, we should talk to a client 12 months before they're thinking about selling, but at least 3 months, so that some of those issues I talked about before can be anticipated and dealt with, and some remedies and improvements can be made from the client's expectations on all sorts of things, pricing, timescale. The longer we have to work with them to help them get the business as ready as it can be for the sale process and handle expectations is critical. And again, we're always happy to invest plenty of time before they formally appoint us to prepare the business in the best way possible.
Okay. And you mentioned the Gantt chart, and in many ways, it looks like you provide a project management role, but who are the other key professionals that are involved in the process?
On the sell side, the key advisors are ourselves as corporate finance advisors, and I'll come back to our role in a minute, and lawyers acting for the selling shareholders. The lawyers tend to get involved partway through the process when we get to heads of terms, for example. That's important for the lawyers to get involved. And then in that third phase, we talked about due diligence, legal contracts. They obviously have a very significant role. But I think it's a good idea to find your lawyers and appoint them right at the beginning of the process. Even though they're not terribly active in the early stages, I think it's important to know your advisory team, make sure that everybody gets on and has the right coordination between ourselves and the lawyers. There's also tax advisors, insurance, property, pension, pieces of advice that don't involve a huge amount of time but are extremely valuable to the outcome if those sorts of issues are relevant. Going back to our role, I think it falls into kind of three areas. There's obviously the technical advice around valuation, the financial aspects of the deal.
Yeah.
But we put a lot of effort into project managing the process, especially when you get into that second and third phases. Even on the simplest transaction, it can involve 40 or 50 people on the sell side and the buy side. So project managing, chasing people, and just trying to keep the process on track with the minimal disruption for you running the business is really important. And then the third area, with owner-managed businesses, family-owned businesses, we jokingly say that we end up being psychiatrists and psychologists because the deal is never just purely about the financial aspects. There's always emotional issues, psychological issues, and it's really important if we're going to guide a business owner from beginning to end through that process that we're able to advise them on making rational, logical, well-informed decisions when they've got a lot of other noise in their heads coming from lots of different directions. So those three aspects of our role, I think, are really important. On the buyer's side of the transaction, there's a lot more advisory activity with the due diligence. But on the sell side, it's relatively straightforward. It's ourselves, it's lawyers, and then it's those other advisors on the specific issues, tax, insurance, etc.
And if I decide, I'd really like to work with Jeremy, and so what exactly is your involvement? Is it just strategic? Do you then delegate it down the line? How does it actually work in reality?
It's a very sleeves rolled up role for our firm. I've described the three areas. I lead the process. I obviously have colleagues who get involved. But I always lead the process from beginning to end. All the significant meetings I would attend, and obviously manage the effort of my colleagues during the process. We take every transaction on board extremely seriously, partly from a self-interest point of view. Most of our fee is linked to a successful outcome, but also from a reputational point of view. We're very dependent on referral for our future work. And therefore delivering on your promises in terms of what we pledged to do at the beginning of the process, and making sure we provide absolute 100% focus on each transaction is vital. So yeah, we're very focused on coming alongside the client, not being in an ivory tower dispensing strategic advice from on high.
Yeah.
And I take that personally, and managing the process side by side with the client through to completion.
Okay. And are there sort of common mistakes that people make? And probably more importantly, how do you help people avoid those pitfalls?
I think we talked about preparation. So lack of preparation is probably the biggest mistake any business owner can make in compromising themselves on price or whether the transaction is actually going to happen. So preparation we could talk for hours about in lots of different respects, but that's probably the biggest mistake, somebody who doesn't take proper professional advice. We talked about unrealistic price expectations. Again, that's why we like to make sure the client has a very realistic view on valuation from day one, because if not, they're going to turn down offers later in the process that are actually fundamentally good offers and that are unlikely to be bettered. I think it's important to go into the sale process with the business having something up its sleeve in terms of growth potential, and we talked about selling when there's still low-hanging fruit for the buyer to benefit from. So make sure you go into the sale process confident that the wheels are not going to come off the business during the sale process.
Right.
Due diligence naturally goes back and looks at 3 or 4 years of trading, but there's naturally a big focus on current trading and short-term prospects. So go into the sale process with something up your sleeve and make sure the business, as best you can, performs well during the sale process. And finally, I would always advise the shareholders to treat all the buyers with respect during the process, because whilst only one party will end up buying the business, you'll have probably dealt with a large number of potential buyers, some of whom will be competitors or will certainly be in your sector. And therefore you want to part on good terms with the parties that are not buying the business, and to make sure that there's a decent relationship going forward between the business and those other parties.
So I've got this picture in my mind that when we get to the end of the process, there's a shake of hands, money's transferred into the bank, we crack the champagne and we sail off into the sunset. So is that what happens in reality, or is there something that happens after the sale?
That's probably what happens on Wolf of Wall Street and those sort of films, but it's never that straightforward. With owner-managed businesses, family-owned businesses, the business is almost always somewhat dependent on the selling shareholders. They might be full-time chief exec, or they might be retired, but still somewhat involved in the business. So yes, most of the purchase price is paid on completion, and all the activity of the lawyers and the advisors finishes. But there's often contractual commitments for anything from 3 months to 18 months, 2 years, where the selling shareholders are required to have some involvement in the business. It might be just to be available on the end of the phone or email. It might be to work in the business maybe 4 days a week, reducing to 3 days, 2 days over a period of time. So going back to where we tried to set clients' expectations up front, we tried to make the point that no, heading straight off to the beach is unlikely to be possible. To the extent there is an earn-out or deferred element to the payment of the purchase price, it's in the selling shareholders' interest to remain somehow involved in the business, have access to management accounts at a minimum, but ideally to have some engagement with the business during that earn-out period, particularly if it's linked to performance, so that they can impact the earn-out positively. There are frustrations that selling shareholders have, having sold the business, where they're working in the business part-time or full-time, and that's just to do with a different culture of a large acquisitive group and a smaller family-owned or owner-managed business. So, for example, we advised on the sale of a consultancy business in the built environment last year. They became part of a large group which has something like 200 subsidiaries, and that group has a very fixed way of running the accounting system and getting each subsidiary to fire information up to head office to prepare management accounts in a certain way to a certain format. So that was completely alien to the client. The client did things in their own way to suit their needs and circumstances. So they found that quite a jolt to adjust to that type of reporting. But that's the quid pro quo for receiving the price for the business and accepting that big groups do need to control their subsidiaries in certain ways, which, as long as it's respectful and realistic in terms of being deliverable, is part of the price you pay for selling your business.
Yeah, and throughout, Jeremy, you've mentioned a number of things that's important to cover off at the beginning, and I think you mentioned a complimentary session that people would get at the outset. So how does that first part of the process work exactly?
So we're typically introduced to a potential client through either a previous client or a friend of a previous client, or a private equity person or a banker or a solicitor. And we're always keen to obviously meet with the potential client, gather information on their business, and do research. We may have done some transactions in the past in their sector. So that information gathering, to be able to give the client some guidance without any charge or obligation from us, is important, partly in a self-serving way, because most of our fee is linked to a successful outcome. So we want the client to go into the process properly informed with realistic expectations. And from the client's point of view, we're more than happy to provide that advice without any charge, because they need that as part of their preparation and going into the process with their eyes wide open. Also, it enables our referrer to feel that we've looked after the referral, even if they don't appoint us. At least they can see that we've tried to educate the potential client and that hopefully if they do appoint us, they're going into it with their eyes wide open and properly informed.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you.